I mean, people need to have their voices heard. This stuff that we're getting now regarding the student protests and anti-Semitism is just complete garbage. If you distract people from the main problem, which is what's going on in Gaza, by talking about anti-Semitism, you diminish the whole purpose of the demonstration. You know, with what's happening in Gaza, we're saying this is insane. We have to find a way to stop it.
My name is Audrey Hausig, and I'm going to interview Neil Hausig, my father. The purpose of this interview is to bring attention to the genocide happening in Palestine and to give it historical context. So there have been protests against the genocide in Gaza by students at Columbia University and now many other universities. I can actually hear the helicopters flying above University of Pennsylvania, where just an hour ago they started their own encampment. These have been reminiscent of the 1968 protests against the Vietnam War, specifically at Columbia University, and you were there at that protest.
Okay. We had lots of friends who were studying at Columbia, and we lived about a 10-minute subway ride away. And there was a meeting one night where several thousand kids were going to get together to, plan an occupation of the school. And so we went up to talk about it. I had been involved in protests for the previous 2 or 3 years against the war, because most of my friends and myself believed that this was an insane venture by the United States that had no justification and no basis in reality. Most people had no idea who the Vietnamese were, where Vietnam was. It was strange that the country was going to war without any real knowledge or understanding of what was happening in the country they were attacking. And it seemed to have very little basis in reality. So going up to Columbia that night, all kinds of people were going to be up there. And we went to hear what everybody had to say and be a part of it.
So the protest against the Palestinian genocide has been mischaracterized as anti-Semitic and dangerous, and it's done so as a means to discredit and distract. And this is done by the media, the US and Israeli governments, even though there's a huge number of Jewish students and other Jewish people involved with the protest. This is a narrative they continue to push. And so the students at George Washington University have created an encampment as well, along with students from Howard University, Georgetown, American University. And so it made me think about how when you were a student at George Washington University, and I'm wondering what was the response of the university and the media then about the actual anti-Semitism that you dealt with?
There were people in America in 1961 all over the country who'd never met anyone who was Jewish before. Washington had a big Jewish population, so it wasn't terrible, but it was just things happened all the time. I was an athlete and playing on the sports teams, there weren't too many Jewish guys. The anti-Semitism in America is more institutional than on a practical level. And I think that's, it's the same thing with racism in America. It's institutional. So people have trouble understanding it because they don't feel a particular thing, even though they are, by their actions and their inactions, they're supporting it.
When did you start to notice this weaponization of anti-Semitism as a way to suppress protest?
It used to be that you hated America. It was always about the good people that loved America and didn't protest and didn't object to what America did. And then the bad people, the ones who didn't love America, didn't agree with what the country was doing. As Jews, we were kind of felt apart from the society in general. You always had to keep an eye out for, what was going on and who you were dealing with. And, after a while you get used to it, so you don't pay attention. And all of a sudden it comes and smacks you in the head. It's just part of growing up in America. And even in New York, which had a huge Jewish population, it was prevalent. It was just part of life. I think the stuff that we're getting now regarding the student protests and anti-Semitism is just complete garbage. One of the ideas of college campus in America is that it's a place where you can speak your mind, make your case. So I think that the use of anti-Semitism as a means of suppressing the belief that people have that there's a genocide going on in Gaza is just, you know, the usual stuff that they do. There's always a reason why people aren't doing the wrong thing. You know, it's like the government's always right. If you distract people from the main problem, which is what's going on in Gaza, by talking about anti-Semitism, you diminish the whole purpose of the demonstration.
The students keep bringing the focus back to the genocide of Palestinians. Over 43,000 people have been murdered, the majority consisting of babies, children, parents, healthcare workers, journalists, aid workers. All of the universities and hospitals in Gaza have been destroyed. Just a few days ago, hundreds of people's bodies were found in a mass grave, many of whom had their hands tied behind them, indicating execution. And we're seeing all of this unfold on our phone. We're watching it. Whereas in 1968, you had to rely on much less information. So there's just like all this visual proof, but at the same time, the media and the government are still able to spin things to dehumanize Palestinians, to mischaracterize the students as violent, to completely ignore the other genocides in the Congo and the Sudan. So it just makes me want to ask you, like, how are the protests different now and how are they the same?
Basically, they come from like a belief system about how the world should be, that we shouldn't be beating the crap out of people because it only, you know, killing just begets more killing. And everybody knows it. But I think because it's all done in real life now, it's under more of a microscope than it was then. I mean, I think about going up to Colombia to the computer, and it fit in a room that was 30 by 30, the one computer that they had. So the information wasn't as readily available, but you could get the information if you look for it. Now there's tons of information that's available, but you don't know what's real and what's not real. We've gone to a point of distortion. And so we distort the issue of what's happening with Palestine, the protesters' issue, by talking about anti-Semitism. What happened in Vietnam, we were actually living it. You know, soldiers were coming home, people were waiting to get drafted. People came back who were so disturbed from the PTS, post-traumatic stress, and then also from the use of the chemicals that were defoliating the trees. And we were killing hundreds of thousands of people. And the government, our government, didn't feel a thing. And they were right. They felt that they were absolutely right in what they were doing. And if you were protesting it for the longest time, there was something wrong with you. But the real issue about the protests is that, I mean, I think I went for the first time in 1964 or 65, and we protested all the time whenever there was something. But the war didn't end until 1975. And despite all of the efforts and the millions of people who protested and did stuff and burned themselves, and the incredible amount of energy that went into trying to stop the war didn't stop the war.
You said, like, you protested for all these years and it didn't stop the war, but I know you're still out there every Sunday protesting the genocide. So, you know, how do you stay hopeful that these today's protests will at the very least help stop the US government and our universities from funding genocide, much less divesting from the Israeli occupation. Like, how do you hope? Why are you still out there every Sunday?
I mean, you don't really have a choice. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, this is what you can do. You can only work with the tools that you have. But in terms of what you're hoping for, I mean, what happened after Vietnam is that the government's response was to stop the draft so that every family wouldn't be involved in the process, so wouldn't have to be accountable to most Americans. And the wars that followed were fought by a volunteer army, which was a tiny part of the population. And, you know, we protested Afghanistan and we protested Iraq. And 20 years later, we're still in Afghanistan. And so I think it's important. I mean, people need to have their voices heard, but it's incredibly frustrating. You know, the history of protest is that you look at the whole woke story, you see what happens in contemporary America. Woke really means wake up, you're such a bloody cretin that you don't know what's going on. It really talks about a level of unconsciousness and stupidity that's really profound.
Absolutely. And that's a term that comes from Black culture. So of course it's going to be especially scrutinized.
But the response is to denigrate it because, not because people are offended by it, as much as because that's what you do. You denigrate whatever you don't agree with, or you don't want to agree with, or you don't want to change. They're not even asking you to change. They're just asking you to open your eyes, which is such a simple process. And, you know, with what's happening in Gaza, we're saying, this is insane. We have to find a way to stop it.